We're going to talk about diffusion and active transport in this video. Okay, so what I have got here is a room. In the corner of the room there, I've got a gas jar with, and there's no drafts in this room or anything. Okay, I've got a gas jar with, let's say, chlorine in it. Okay, so those little red dots are chlorine molecules. Now, if I take the lid off the gas jar and leave it for an amount of time, I can be absolutely 100% certain that what happens is here we get them evenly spread out, and the reason why they're going to be evenly spread out is because all the gas molecules are all flying around in random directions, and it's just the way the stats of it work, the averages work, that the likelihood of them all being evenly spread out, that's what's going to happen. You know, there's no way they're all going to end up all randomly just up one there in one corner of the room. There is a chance of that happening, but it's so incredibly small that, you know, we can rule that out. So with diffusion then, it's caused by the random movement of the molecules, and it's always from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And this is extremely important in so many places in biology. So let's have a look at some of those examples now then. Okay, so what I've got here is I've got a capillary. So a capillary is just enough room for one red blood cell to squeeze through. Okay, there's red blood cells. These black cells are the capillary wall, the endothelial cells, and this cell here is a muscle cell. Okay, so the muscle cell is using up all the oxygen, doing a lot of respiration. So that means it's got a low concentration of oxygen. So oxygen is going to diffuse out of the capillary, into the muscle cell. And it's moving down the concentration gradient, and that's how the muscle gets its oxygen. And at the same time with that, we are going to get carbon dioxide, which the muscle cells making due to respiration, and that's going to be high concentration of CO2 in the muscle, and that's going to diffuse back into the blood, into the blood, and dissolve in the plasma of the blood, and it will be carried away. Okay, so that's really important, how the muscle gets its oxygen and gets rid of its waste products by diffusion from the blood. I will see this happening time and time again. So let's have a look. This is the opposite situation now. We're looking at the lung. Okay, so here, so we're in the lung. This is an alveolus. Well, this is an air sac actually. It's an air sac made up of several alveoli, and we have got gas that you've breathed in those little air sacs, and each of them, we've got a very dense network of capillaries around those. So if we now go to this diagram, looking in a little bit more detail, we've got this is our capillary here, and this is the air that we've just breathed in. Okay, so the blood that's going to be returned to the lung, it's low in oxygen. So that means oxygen is going to diffuse from the air sac into the capillary, and then it's going to be carried away and taken around the rest of the body. At the same time, the concentration of CO2 in this blood, which is coming towards the lung, it's got high CO2, whereas there's not much CO2 in the air you've just breathed in. So the CO2 is going to diffuse down the concentration gradient in the opposite direction. Right, now let's have a look at this. Now this is the small intestine here. We've got the small intestine, it's a cross section through it. And if you look in the surface has got these invaginations in it, and to increase the surface area of the intestine, and they're called villi, a single villus plural villi. Okay, so this is showing, this diagram here showing the villi in greater detail, and here we've got the capillaries running through the middle of the villus. We've got one layer of cell. This is one cell thick. That's the epithelial cells lining the gut. And here we've got all the food. Okay, so we've got the digested food here. So that means usually we've got quite a high concentration of small molecules like glucose, amino acids, which have been broken down, and they are going to diffuse from the gut across the wall of the villi into the capillaries. But that's not quite the full story there, because that wouldn't get rid of all of the glucose and the amino acids in the gut. There'd still be a little bit of those dissolved in the gut. To get rid of those, the very last bit, we do need some active transport, because the concentration after a while of glucose is going to be higher in here than it is out here. So active transport, we're taking active transport is when the molecules are going against the concentration gradient. So in other words, they're going from a low concentration to a higher concentration, and that needs energy. That won't happen just by itself. We've seen, with the example of the taking the lid off the gas jar, there was no way the molecules are all going to concentrate them up in one corner. They're going to spread out. So if you want to make them go against the concentration gradient, you need energy, and the gut does that to get to squeeze the very last glucose and amino acids and goodness out of what's in the small intestine and get that into the bloodstream. Okay, so there's an example of active transport happening at the same time as diffusion. Right, let's look at some plant examples here then. So what you may recognize this diagram, this is a cross section through a leaf. So we've got a leaf like that, and what we're looking through, that we're looking at this sort of bit here, we're looking at cross section. Now the carbon dioxide, it's going to be, you're going to have low carbon dioxide inside the leaf. The reason for that is because what's happening in the leaf, you're having photosynthesis, and of course that uses up carbon dioxide. So the concentration of carbon dioxide is going to be lower inside the leaf than it is outside. So what's going to happen is CO2 is going to diffuse into the leaf. And of course, you've got this very dense layer of cells here, the palisade layer, and they're going to be doing a lot of photosynthesis. The light's coming in this way, remember, yeah? So they're going to have, it's going to have a concentration gradient. You're going to have even lower concentrations of CO2 here because you've got loads of photosynthesis, and that means the CO2 is going to carry on diffusing into those cells down the concentration gradient. And oxygen is actually going to diffuse in the opposite way, because during the time you're photosynthesizing, of course, you are making oxygen, so oxygen is going to diffuse in a different color. Oxygen is going to diffuse that way, and it's going to go out where there's lower concentration of oxygen outside the cell. Okay, let's look at another example of diffusion in plants then. Well, what we've got here is you probably recognize it, this is a root hair cell. And again, it's got this long protrusion to increase the surface area of the cell. Now this is inside the plant here, and on the other side, this is the soil. Now the soil is going to have things like nitrate ions dissolved in it, NO3 minus, and also things like phosphate ions, PO4 3 minus, and things like potassium as well, and other ions. Now they can diffuse in at first by down the concentration gradient, but when the plant's taken some in, then you're going to have a higher concentration of nitrate inside the cells, and more phosphate and more potassium inside the cells. So the only way of getting these ions into the cell, they're going against the concentration gradient, so there is some active transport there, and that will require energy. So that's one of the things a plant needs energy for. It needs to respire in order to be able to make those ions go against the concentration gradient, where they're in low concentration in the soil and the plant's actually got more of them inside of it. Right, here's another example. If you've done the nervous system, you might recognize this is called this is a synapse. Okay, so this is on this side we have got one nerve cell, and this is another nerve cell, and the impulse can't jump across this gap. This gap is called the synapse. So it's an electrical impulse, and so how do nerve cells, how does the nerve impulse jump across the gap? Well, if you've done it, you probably realize that what happens is at the end of the cell, you've got these are called vesicles, and you have those little red dots they're called neurotransmitter molecules. Okay, and when the cell is stimulated, when a nerve impulse comes down this cell, what happens is it causes these little vesicles to join up with the cell surface and pop open. You can see one of them has just done that there. Now, the neurotransmitter has got to go across this gap, and when it binds to one of those little receptors on the other side of the other nerve cell, this then triggers another nerve impulse in the cell. So that's how the nerve impulse jumps across this gap called the synapse. Now, how do these little red molecules of neurotransmitters, why do they move across the gap? Well, they're moving down the concentration gradient. There's a low concentration gradient on this side, and there's a higher concentration where they're just being released. And you may think that, right, that might be a bit slow for a nerve impulse because it's got to be instantaneous, but this gap is absolutely tiny. So, and because it's such a tiny gap, diffusion across it occurs incredibly quickly, and so it's, you know, in a fraction of a second, milliseconds, and so it is. It's okay. It works. Right. We've got one more example here of active transport. Now, what I've drawn here, this is actually the thyroid gland, which you don't need to know about for GCSE. The thyroid gland makes a hormone called thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone has got, it's very unusual, it has atoms of iodine, the element iodine, incorporated into its structure. So that means the thyroid gland needs iodine. Now, iodine is only found in very, very, very low concentrations in your food, and the thyroid gland needs a lot of iodine. So the way the thyroid gland has to use active transport to get the iodine, as the iodine actually, into the thyroid gland where it's needed. So it does active transport. Yeah. So hopefully those examples will serve to sort of, like, you've done them all, to sort of to illustrate when, you know, when diffusion occurs an awful lot of the time. It's from high concentration to low concentration. Sometimes we've seen that diffusion is not enough for biological systems, and they need to transport molecules across the concentration gradient, and in that case, we're going to need active transport.